Thank you for joining today's webinar, Sheep Lice Control Essentials in Brief. My name is Jodie Rosé O'Brien and I'm on the Sheep Connect SA team. Sheep Connect is supported by Australian Wool Innovation, the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund and the Department of Primary Industries and Regions. For more information on Sheep Connect SA, you can go to our website, sheepconnectsa.com.au, and please follow us on Twitter at Sheep Connect SA. Today's webinar has been recorded and we'll upload the recording to the Sheep Connect SA YouTube channel in the coming days. We welcome you to revisit the webinar yourself and share it with colleagues. At this time, I'll hand over to Jane, who'll give us today's webinar.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting us to give today's webinar. I think we should be able to make some explanations to farmers about sheep lice control that will hopefully help them achieve great outcomes. Most people have probably heard of the launch of a very new product called Flexolt. I'm Jane Morrison. I'm one of the tech veterinarians at MSD Animal Health, or Cooper's Animal Health, as most people will know us with the yellow drums. And I'll just take you through a little bit of lice control because I always like to talk about lice control. There's a lot of management things to consider. And then we will cover the new product that's been launched, which is an oral lice product that can be used in any length of wool. So we'll look at all of these things through the webinar. Sheep lice control, we'll look at Fluralana, the molecule, and what Flexolt, the product, does, and how that's going to bring flexibility to lice control on farm and hopefully better outcomes and more successful lice eradication on farm. So one thing I always like to talk about is sheep lice itself. And I think one of the key things is the second point on this slide, where 70% of properties that have lice this year will have lice next year. And the most important thing about that is that the reason only 30% of people are successful in eradicating lice really doesn't have that much to do with what chemical they choose to use. It's far more related to management on farm. Now, traditionally, with sheep lice control, we've had to only have that one opportunity to control lice, and that's off shears or short wool, so less than 6 weeks of wool. And if we messed that up, then we had to wait a whole another year before we got another chance. And it's very easy to mess that up because we can have lambs at foot, we can have mismusters, there's all sorts of things that go on. So one of the things that this new product will help do is alleviate some of those management issues, but it won't alleviate all of them. So if people have lambs at foot, they'll be able to treat the lambs and the ewes at the same time with the same product, and that will really help. The other thing is if people have split shearing, so they've got different mobs being shorn at different times, that really in the past has made it almost impossible to eradicate lice, whereas now, even though they're being shorn at different times, they can be treated at the same time. So there's a lot of management things that the product does help overcome. There's still a lot of management things that will have to be done on farm to make sure that their lice control is successful. Lice only live on sheep, and that's a really key thing to remember. One of the things that fascinates me about sheep lice is that they are one of the easiest things to kill. They don't like heat, they don't like cold, they don't like hot, they don't like wet, they don't like dry. There's really not much that they like, but they're really hard to find. And that's why with traditional methods that are topical, we've only been able to control them off shears when we have very little wool, and we also have a lot less lice. So it's important to sort of understand their life cycle a bit. They develop slowly. And so one of the things that I think a lot of people maybe misunderstand is, where did the lice come from? It's very easy to blame the neighbour or to blame some sheep that you just bought in, or things that happened recently. But with sheep lice, their life cycle takes about 35 days. So it's just over a month for an adult lice to go around the cycle and become another adult louse. And that's quite long when you consider something like a barber's pole worm actually only takes 19 days to achieve the same thing. The other thing about sheep lice is that they're not very prolific breeders. So, in fact, a female sheep louse only lays 2 eggs every 3 days. So she's not even laying an egg a day, and it takes more than a month for that egg to become another adult louse. When we again go back to Barber's poleworm, they take 19 days and they lay 10,000 eggs a day. So we're talking about a population that increases at a massive rate, 10,000 eggs a day every 19 days. Whereas with sheep lice, it's 2 eggs every 3 days for 35 days to make that cycle work. So their population builds up really slowly. So one of the key things if you want to eradicate lice is to know where the lice came from, so that when you're putting in a program to get rid of your lice, you can close the right door. So if you know where it came from, then you can block that hole. And it's key to think that they do take a long time, because it takes 4 to 6 months before you're going to notice that you have lice. So if you do get it from the neighbour, if a neighbour's sheep were in there a month ago and then you go, well, now I've got lice, it actually didn't come from the neighbour. Your lice arrived 3, 4, 5 months ago, so before the neighbour's sheep got in. So it's really important to realise that when you first see lice, they arrived about 4 months ago. And part of the reason for that is because you won't see rubbing from lice until there's about 2,000 to 5,000 lice present on the sheep. And that's also the only time you're going to find the lice. So the lice population has to build up to quite a lot before you're even going to realise that they're there. So it does take a long time. Sheep have lice, or when sheep are rubbing, it's really important to actually determine that it is lice. So they have this long life cycle. They take a long while to build up. And the other complicating factor in eradicating lice is that they need to have about 2,000 to 5,000 lice before they start rubbing. And they also need to have about 2,000 to 5,000 lice before you can find them when you look, because they're tiny. They're going to be over the whole sheep. So they're quite difficult to find. And it's really important that we do find lice. So if you've got sheep that are rubbing, because that's obviously one of the primary thing that you're going to see is that they're rubbing, biting and pulling at their wool. And that's going to cause cotted fleeces, fleece discoloration, derangement, reduced fleece weight, and predisposition to fly strike. And as I said, that takes time to build up. But if you've got sheep that are rubbing, it may actually not be lice. So it's really important to make sure that we do find the lice, because it could also be grass seeds, itch mite, fleece rot, fly strike, dermo or tender fleece causing them to rub. If you inspect sheep properly for lice when they're rubbing and you cannot find lice, it's not lice causing them to rub. If you inspect them and you can find lice, then it probably is. It could also be contributed to these other things, but if there's lice there, that's the issue. If they're rubbing and there's no lice, then it's something else causing them to rub. It's not lice. And you really need to make sure that you closely inspect to differentiate these issues. So when we're inspecting sheep for lice, there's a couple of key things. We need really good eyesight and we need good light. So if you need to wear reading glasses to read, then you need to wear reading glasses to find lice. And the reason I say you need good light is, A, it obviously makes things easier to see. But as I said earlier, sheep lice don't like much and they don't like light. So what they'll do when you put light on them is they'll try and move away. So something that's really small, and you saw before it's about 1.8 millimetres, something that's really small is quite hard to see, but if it's moving, it's much easier to see. So if we have good light there, it's going to make the lice try and get away from the light, so they'll move. So it's going to make them a lot easier to see. So I would never look for sheep lice in a shearing shed, because there's really not generally enough light. I might drag it, over to the edge of the shearing shed where I've got some sunlight coming in. I'll generally look at them outside in the yards. The other thing when you're looking for them is make sure you pick the sheep most likely to have lice. So pick the sheep that are rubbing or biting, so that you've got your best chance of finding lice. You should examine about 10 sheep, and you should do 10 partings down each side of the sheep or down one side of the sheep, about 10 centimetres long. And a lot of people think I'm a bit mad, because I will often ask people, how many lice do you have? Now, if you're a sheep producer and you've got any lice, that's enough. It means all of your sheep have got lice, and that's fine. But if we want to figure out where they came from, how many lice they have actually becomes quite relevant. So if you tip over 10 sheep and you can't find lice on 8 of them, and then 2 of them are absolutely loaded with lice, so every time you part the fleece, you can't even count the lice, well, those 2 sheep are problem sheep. So, I mean, they might be the neighbour's sheep. They might be sheep you brought in. They might be sheep that were missed at the last treatment, or sheep that weren't treated properly at the last treatment, or sheep that weren't even mustered at the treatment. So it indicates to you that, yes, everyone's going to have lice, but these 2 sheep are a problem, and they've then reinfested the whole mob. So trying to get that picture of how many lice you've got, and you don't need to be accurate on the count. It's just, I've got less than 1 per parting. I've got, 2 to 3 per parting, or I've got more than 5 per parting, or, I can't even count them. So getting that idea helps you also understand how long the population's been there and where it's come from. And so that will hopefully help you figure out how you got lice, and therefore shut the right door so that you're not here again next year. So it's all very well to treat the lice, but if we know where they came from, then we can block the hole and make sure that we don't end up in the same situation. Lice only transmit from sheep to sheep in close contact. So a lot of people ask questions about, can they, when you've got fleece wool sitting on the fence, can that transfer lice? The answer essentially is no. Lice will drop out of that wool on the fence within an hour. The lice will die. The other thing is that sheep that are clean and don't have lice won't rub on a fence, so they're not going to actually be in contact with it. So the only way sheep lice transfer is when there's close contact, so either camps at night or when they're yarded. And they need to have that close contact because the sheep get warm when they're in close contact, the lice get too hot, they run up the staple, they're up the top of the staple moderating their temperature. Then when they get cold, they want to come back down, and they don't necessarily come down the same staple. So that's how they transfer from one sheep to another with close contact. The major source of them, well, it's definitely always other lousy sheep. It can be stray sheep, can be purchased or introduced sheep. Now, when you're purchasing sheep, even if you look for lice, if we remember that you need 2,000 to 5,000 lice before you can find them, you can look at 10 sheep in a pen that you're purchasing and find no lice. And it doesn't mean they're lice-free. It just means they don't have detectable lice. So they could have 1,000 lice or 500 lice, and you're never going to find them. So always assume that any sheep you're bringing on your property have lice, even if you can't detect them when you inspect the sheep. One of the most common reasons people will still have sheep lice is that there's sheep missed at muster, whether that's at muster for shearing or at muster for treatment. And so there are sheep that aren't treated at all. There's also the bottom one there, failure to eradicate at previous treatment, and that can be sheep that are treated but not treated properly. So if you're using a backliner, it may not be stripes down either side of the back. It may only be halfway down. There might be a missed sheep. It might be the wrong dose. Even with our new oral product, Flexol, it could be the wrong dose. So you need to make sure that you're following label directions. That my sort of little mantra is 100% of the sheep need to be treated 100% well. And that can be quite hard to achieve, and it does need quite a lot of attention to detail. One of the other big sources, well, 2 of the other big sources of lice are split shearing. So when you've got differing shearings across the mob, including unshorn lambs at foot, and lambing ewes. So when you're treating for lice and it's really close to lambing, the lice that haven't yet been killed on the ewe can transfer to the lamb. They hang out on the lamb for a little while. Once the chemical level drops on the ewe, they whip back over onto the ewe. So split shearing and lambing ewes are 2 really big issues in lice control that we need to be managing, and we need to be conscious of when we're putting in a lice eradication program. So there's some really key principles that we should always follow in lice control. The key one, as I said, 100% of the sheep 100% well. So we need to treat all sheep on the property at the same time. So that's rams, lambs, ewes, wethers, killers, shedding sheep. If there are sheep and they're on the property, treat them at the same time. We need to get complete musters. And that's one of the big reasons that a lot of people won't eradicate lice. And we know that there's a lot of people in pastoral areas, and there's quite a few of those in South Australia, where you're never going to get a complete muster. And that's okay. We'll put in a program for you where we can control your lice and keep it at a level where it's not impacting on your fleece value. It might involve 2 treatments a year because we know that there aren't complete musters or you've got a lot of strays. So it's really important to get complete musters. If you're using a backliner product, it's really important that the sheep are cleanly shorn. And that's because what we're relying upon there is for that chemical to travel around the body and find all of the lice. The lice don't circumnavigate the sheep. They hang out in a really small area. If we don't cleanly shear the sheep, there's tufts of wool that are going to be present. Lice can exist in there, and the chemical just doesn't have the capacity to penetrate in there. And that's why traditional long wool treatments, where you're using a topical treatment for long wool, it's never going to find all of the lice. So when you're using a backliner, you need to give it the best chance. So they've got to be cleanly shorn, you put it on properly, and it's going to find those lice. You do need to rotate between effective chemical classes, and that doesn't mean you need to rotate every year. The 2 key principles in rotation really with sheep lice are that you shouldn't use the same chemical group twice in a season, or twice in a year if you like. So if you use a product in long wool because you have lice, you need to make sure you use a different active off shears if you're going to treat off shears. We've got lots of actives on the market, so it's important to rotate. When you're using an active and you're getting effective control, probably about every 3 years, you should jump off that active onto another one, even just for 1 year, and then you can come back again, just to mix it up a bit and make sure that you're not building up a resistance. So it is important to rotate, and there's a couple of key principles there. We need to make sure that we know the weight of the sheep and that we're accurately dosing, and that's also going to help reduce any chance of resistance, as well as make sure we get effective control. Follow the label directions carefully, and then do not mix treated sheep and untreated sheep. This is a really key thing, and most people will look at this and say, we're saying not to mix them. You know, how long after I treat this sheep can I then mix it with my clean sheep? And with something like Flexolt, that's 4 weeks. With all of your backliners that are on the market, that's 6 weeks. However, the thing to remember is it's actually the reverse of what you naturally think. So it's not about, will the treated sheep give my untreated sheep lice? If you allow the 4 weeks for Flexol or the 6 weeks for everything else, they won't, because you will have effectively controlled the lice on the treated sheep. The big risk in this is those untreated sheep. Unless you can be 100% sure that those untreated sheep are lice-free, and we know that they can have lice and they can have less than 2,000 lice, but we can't tell they've got lice. So unless you can be 100% sure that the untreated sheep are lice-free, what will actually happen is that you'll treat these sheep, you'll wait your 4 weeks or your 6 weeks, then you'll mix them with the untreated sheep, but it's actually the untreated sheep that will give your treated sheep lice. So it's really important, if you're going to mix them, to be 100% sure that those untreated sheep are lice-free. And in reality, the only way to know that is if you've had those sheep for 2 years or 3 years and you've never seen any signs of lice and you haven't been treating them, they're probably lice-free. Other than that, there's always a question mark over it. So the golden rule is, do not mix treated sheep and untreated sheep. Make sure we prevent reinfestation of lice. So fencing is obviously a key issue with that. And also when you have got split shearings or you've got unshorn lambs. And the final point with the quarantine is preventing reinfestation. Make sure you quarantine and appropriately treat any introduced sheep, so sheep that you're purchasing, including rams, until it's certain they're lice-free. So that's where Flexolt is actually also going to be really helpful as a quarantine treatment, because traditionally we've had to shear and treat animals on arrival to make sure that we can get rid of their lice. With Flexolt, it doesn't matter how much wool they've got, we can give them a really effective treatment, get their lice under control before we bring them into the flock. However, we also need to be sure that while we're introducing them, they're lice-free, the sheep that are already in the flock. Otherwise, they'll just infest the new sheep as well. So that's sort of covering some really basics and quite quickly in lice control. And if you do have any questions of that, pop them into the chat and I will endeavour to answer them at the end. But that was just a bit of an overview to make sure that we're always conscious that correct application and use of chemicals, but most importantly, management practices is where you're going to, that's what's going to make the difference between a successful lice treatment and a non-successful lice treatment. So then we'll move on to Flexolt, which is a flexible oral lice treatment. And there's been a lot of excitement, I guess, within the industry that we have managed, to get an oral treatment. But I think one of the key things with this product is that you can use it in any length of wool and get effective control. So traditionally we had to wait for off shears or short wool to be able to control our lice. And then anything we used in long wool was a bit of a stopgap. It just sort of held things at bay until we could get to shearing. With Flexolt, we've got a product that it doesn't matter when you use it, the lice control will be just as effective. So it doesn't have to be used short wool off shears to get effective lice control. And that's a really key point for people that have unshorn lambs at foot or have split shearings or are bringing in introduced sheep that they wanted to give a quarantine treatment. So there's a lot of benefits to that. I've actually worked at Cooper's Animal Health for about 18 years, and I've talked a lot about sheep lice, and I've probably for 18 years been saying that we will never be able to control sheep lice with an injectable or an oral product. And that's because sheep lice don't suck blood, they only eat dead skin cells. But we've found this active, Fluralana, which is an isoxazoline, so it's a new class of chemical with a unique mode of action, and it is exclusive to animal health. And the beauty of this molecule is that you can give it orally, and it actually secretes out in the swint and sweat glands. So it doesn't need to be in the blood. And this was all discovered when this product was used in cats and dogs in a product called Brevecto, which was for ticks and fleas. And vets started reporting that it was actually controlling mites that were not bloodsuckers, mites that just, Sarcoptes and Demodex, that just lived on the skin and ate skin cells and lived in the hair follicles. So from that, we realised that this product wasn't just in the blood, and it was actually excreting onto the skin. And so we started looking at it for sheep lice control. And what we did find was that it has excellent contact and feeding activity against sheep body lice. So it was really a massive innovation to think that we could orally dose a sheep and have the product come out into the swint and sweat glands and contact the lice and have them eating that chemical through the dead skin cells and be able to control lice. And that's why it's able to do it regardless of wool length, because we're not trying to get through all of that wool and find the lice. We're actually coming out from the skin and contacting the lice that way. So Flexol, as I said, is an isoxazoline, so it will control isoxazoline susceptible lice, and that includes strains that are resistant to our SPs and our IGRs, so insect growth regulators, and it can be used on sheep and lambs with any length of wool. So because we're giving it orally, the length of wool becomes irrelevant. It's coming out in that swint and sweat. Now, the lambs have to be over 6 kilos. Most people probably won't be doing much with any lambs anyway until they're about 6 kilos. It's an oral treatment that you can use off shears. You can use it up to 7 days off shears. You can use it in unshorn lambs. You can use it in short wool. You can use it in long wool. You can use it whatever wool length and whatever time that suits your management practice and suits your lice control program. It is effective in off shears or long wool ewes with lambs at foot. Just remembering you need to treat both the ewes and the lambs. So that's 100% of the sheep, 100% well. So if you're treating ewes and they've got lambs, you need to treat those lambs as well. So to work out that this product was going to be effective in any wool length and really provide effective control. We did a lot of trials to get to these claims. And when we did these trials, we did 15 field studies in Australia, and we looked at different rainfall zones. We looked at different sheep, so our fine wool merinos, coarse wool merinos, crossbreds. We had ewes and unshorn lambs at foot. We had different ages, different sexes, and of course, we had different wool lengths. So we had in some pen studies, actually, we had sheep 1 week before shearing. But in the field studies, we had off shears, we had 7 days off shears, we had 3 months wool, 6 months wool, 9 months wool. So we really covered every angle to make sure that, sheep with a lot of lice, it was going to be controlled. As I said before, the lambs have got to be over 6 kilos. One of the other things about it is because it's oral, it's not affected by rainfall before or after treatment. So that really helps again with some management issues when we're around shearing and we get rain. What do we do? When do we treat? And how's that going to impact our control? When you're using Flexolt, it's not going to impact it. So that's a really big positive. It's a very safe product. It has at least a 5 times safety margin. We dosed sheep up to 5 times and there were no clinical effects seen. So it's more than 5 times, but we haven't continued until we caused problems. We just know that 5 times is probably enough. So in these field trials, and you'll see on that little map there that they are quite focused. There's one in Queensland, a lot in New South Wales and Victoria. There are fortunately 2 in South Australia, and there's none in WA. One thing to just keep in mind, when we did all these trials, it was the times of COVID. So unfortunately, we were locked out of WA. They became their own country almost during COVID, so no one was allowed over there. So we couldn't run any trials in WA. We did manage to find a contractor in, because we were also locked out of South Australia. We did find a contractor in South Australia, and so we managed to get a couple of trials there, which was fabulous. And then the bulk of them were done in New South Wales and Victoria because I guess we were all considered diseased, and so we were allowed to move around. But that's why there is that bit of an odd distribution, and there's none in WA. But we certainly covered all the different rainfall zones. We covered different sheep types. We just didn't manage to get to one state. So in these 15 trials, they're really quite significant trials. So we do 300 to 500 sheep per group, and they have to have quite a few lice to be part of the study. So they've got to at least have 1 to 5 per parting on every sheep, or a minimum of 30 lice. And what we do is we select or we mark 25 of them as tracer sheep. And the study has to go for 140 days. So to have effective lice control, you basically have to have no lice at 140 days, which is 5 months. So if you can get to 5 months without any lice, the product is highly effective and fully capable of eradicating lice on a property. If it doesn't achieve eradication beyond that point, it does come down to management. But to end up with no lice at 5 months, it's a highly effective product. So we count these 25 sheep various times during the trial. Then when we get to 140 days, again, we count the 25 sheep, and they need to have 0 lice. So if we count the 25 and they have 0 lice, then we count another 25 just to put a bit more pressure on the trial, and they also have to have 0 lice. So when we're talking about products that are on the market and any product that's registered for lice control in Australia, as long as it's not classified as a long wool topical product, they're all capable of eradicating lice because they've all achieved 0 lice at 140 days. The difference with Flexol is it's achieved that whether it's in short wool or off shears or long wool. So it can achieve the same level of control regardless of when you dose them with it. So if we have a quick look at the trials, we've got various off shears trials and short wool. We've got exceptional lice control in all the trials. There is one trial there at the Rocks where it's 99.6, so it almost made it to 100. There was one sheep there that had 22 lice. But the key thing about that trial was that the sheep coughed an awful lot when they were administered the treatment, and we're not really sure why. But they were coughing up the dose. Unfortunately, during a trial, if a sheep coughs up the dose, because it's in a trial, you're not allowed to redose the sheep because that could sway the trial. But what this did show us, and we know that it's got a 5 times safety margin, that if you suspect that a sheep has coughed up the dose or hadn't had all the dose, or you sort of half missed its mouth and didn't give it all to it, it's really, really vital that you redose that sheep. We know there's a massive safety margin. It's more than 5 times. So there's no risk of any issue. If you suspect it didn't get the full dose, redose the sheep. And this really demonstrates that all it takes is that one sheep to cough up its dose. If you don't redose it, it's 100% of the sheep, 100% well. So if you don't think they got 100% of the dose, give them another one. But you can see there that in all these trials, it's achieving 100%, other than where they coughed it up and weren't redosed. So make sure that you do redose any sheep you're concerned about. And that's the same with backliners as well. If you don't think you've got the stripes on properly, add a bit more. It's really important to make sure 100% of the sheep are treated 100% well. Then if we look at the long wool trials, and you'll see it's fully effective lice control in long wool. So it doesn't matter what length of wool these sheep have, it's going to achieve as good a control as if you'd done it off shears. And that really is where a lot of people are calling it a game changer. But that's really where that comes in, that if you've got split shearing, if you've got unshorn lambs, you can treat them and you're going to get the same level of control in those long wool sheep as if you'd done it off shears. So that's a massive difference to lice control. The other brilliant thing is we ran quite a few of these trials out, and there were more in the pen trials that went out to a year or more. And so we sort of say, follow the rules, all those lice control rules we talked about earlier, and you're going to reap the rewards. You can get 100% control right out to 12 months and obviously more with this product, as long as your management is fine, as long as you treat 100% of the sheep 100% well, you're not reintroducing it, you've got 100% masters, and you're quarantine treating any sheep that enter the farm. You'll notice there's one there, so the one at Humula, they were off shears, and at 382 days, so that's more than a year later, it was slightly under 100% at 98.4. And this again, brings a big lesson. We've got all of those other trials, the other 3 there, and there were some more pen trials where we got 100% when we got out to a year. In that trial, there was a couple of sheep that had really low numbers of adult lice, and there were no eggs and no juvenile lice present on any of those sheep. And so that was a recent reinfestation from the neighbours, and that was, we found it at 382 days. It obviously occurred slightly before that. But essentially, the only reason those sheep had lice was because they had a new infestation. So as long as you can keep the lice out, you'll eradicate lice by using the treatment properly. So in summary, when we're using Flexolt as an oral treatment, we get 100% lice control within 3 weeks of treatment. In some trials it was 7 days, but they were all gone by 3 weeks later. We also get no eggs detected somewhere between 14 and 43 days. The trials, most of them were gone by the 3 weeks, along with the lice. There was a couple of long wool trials, so 3 long wool trials that took a bit longer to get rid of all the eggs. But obviously in long wool, there's a lot more eggs and a lot more lice in there. So it obviously just took a little bit longer to find those eggs. But the eggs and the lice are all very much gone by 3 weeks, and a couple of times the eggs were a bit longer. So Flexolt's the first and only oral lice treatment for sheep body lice, and it's the only lice treatment that you can use for effective control in any length of wool. So if we have a quick look at the dose rates and the withholding periods, it is a very low dose rate at 3 mils per 20 kilos. So it's quite a low dose rate, and that dose rate doesn't change regardless of whether you're using it off shears or in long wool. The withholding periods, the meat withholding period is 14 days and the ESI is 54 days. Because it's an oral treatment, there's no wool withholding period, there's no rehandling interval. If you do happen to have sheep that you're milking, you can't use the milk for human consumption. But that's a very small portion of producers in Australia. So when you're applying Flexolt, you can use any standard drench gun. It's literally just an oral drench, like all of the worm drenches that we use. It is a water-based product, which means it can be a little bit viscous in cold weather. So we do recommend that you use a 10mm draw off. Some guns, not many of them, will come with a 6mm draw off, and you just need to make sure you're using a 10mm draw off between the drum and the gun to make sure that you get good refill times and you're not waiting for it to refill. As I've said, a number of times, we need to make sure all the sheep are treated 100% well. So we really recommend that you mark the sheep when you treat them with a crayon. The pack will come with a crayon and a holder, but with a crayon, just give them a mark on their face when you've treated them, and that way you know that every sheep's been treated and you can easily detect that. In fact, I'd even recommend that you do that when you're drenching sheep for worms, just to make sure that you're making sure you get them all. So it's a simple crayon, and we've got a little holder that you can get with the product that will help you mark the sheep just like that on their face, and that way you know that sheep has been effectively treated. So other points on the application, you can't retreat within 54 days. That's the ESI period. That shouldn't be an issue. If for some reason, at 30 days, treated sheep and untreated sheep get boxed and you don't know who's who, just wait another 24 days and then retreat the whole lot. So it's only 54 days and you can always manage that, but you shouldn't retreat within 54 days just because that can affect the withholding periods. As if you've got ewes that are due to lamb, you need to make sure there's 4 weeks between treatment and lambing. So you've noticed on the other slide it takes 3 weeks to kill all the lice. So we allow 4 weeks as a bit of insurance, I guess. Insurance in case there's an outlier that takes a bit more than 21 days, but also insurance because we know that if we're expecting our ewes to lamb in 4 weeks' time, we're probably going to get a couple of early ones. So let's go with 4 weeks, and we know that all the lice will be dead on those ewes before the lambs drop on the ground, because those live lice can transfer onto the lamb and then transfer back to the ewe later. So make sure you're allowing that 4 weeks. At present, we're doing some studies, so we don't know the answer. So we're recommending at the moment that you don't use a worm drench and Flexolt at the same time. We're doing some studies to make sure that it is okay, but we don't want to recommend it until we know that it's not going to affect the worm control or the lice control. So hopefully early next year we'll have some more information on that. But at the moment, just do them 24 hours apart. So if you're going to treat with one or the other today, use the other one tomorrow, just to allow it to sort of dissipate and mix up with the rumen contents, and that should be fine. But don't use them at the same time at the moment. Hopefully we'll have some more information on that in a few months. We haven't had in all the trials any interactions with other products, so you can vaccinate when you're doing it. You can use a fly control product, a topical fly control. That's all fine to do at the same time that you're using it. It's just the worm drench when there's 2 oral products particularly going down at once that we just want to check that that's okay before we recommend it. As I said before, it does have a strong safety margin. It is safe to treat in rams and in pregnant ewes, and in lambs as long as they're over 6 kilos body weight. We've done lots of safety studies on it, but we didn't do studies during joining. So that's when the rams are actually in with the ewes. The reason we didn't do those studies was because it's really not good agricultural practice to do anything with your ewes while the rams are in, because it does increase the chance of embryonic loss and poor conception rates. So what we did do was we used Flexol the day that we put the rams in, so at the very commencement of joining, and we used it when we took them out. So we know it's safe to use at either end, but we wouldn't recommend that you do it during joining. It's probably fine, but you shouldn't do anything to ewes while they're joining, because that can affect your conception rates. So if you want to use Flexol around joining, use it just before the rams go in, or at the time the rams go in, or at the time they come out. It comes in a 20 litre and a 5 litre. The 5 litres will be, the 20 litres are available now, but the 5 litres will be available in mid-September. The thing to remember is it is a low dose volume, and so a 20 litre drum, if you've got a 60 kilo sheep, will treat just over 2,000 sheep. So there's an awful lot of sheep in each drum, which is a great thing because it does create benefits for transport and storage and clean up and disposal. So basically, you've got 3 to 8 times more doses per pack. So you've got a lot less 20-litre drums to be carting about and to be cleaning up. And the other benefit of that low dose rate is that it's simple to set up and use. Basically, you just need a backpack and an applicator. If you want to use a power doser, you certainly can if you use a power doser for drenching. But there's no need for the power doser. You can just use the backpack because the dose is so low. So there's lots of advantages in that low dose as well. We've covered most of these points. Flexolt you can use at any time, any length of wool, whenever you like. And obviously with the other backliner products that are currently on the market, there are some limitations on whether you can use them in other lengths of wool. Backliners for effective control can only be used off shears, and some of them can be used up to 7 days off shears. With Flexolt, you can use it any time. One thing to always think about too is where we've got ewes with unshorn lambs at foot. Now, some products do have claims to be used in unshorn lambs, but they do have an age limit. And where you've got a product that you can use in up to 2 months of age, any lamb that's over 2 months of age is compromising your lice control. And there's not that many properties where all the lambs would be under that at shearing. So make sure you're really thinking about those lambs at foot and what you're doing with them. Obviously, with Flexolt, you can treat them the same. And we've talked about withhold periods and rehandling intervals, so we've pretty much covered most of that. And one of the key things is it really does redefine sheep lice control. Everything we know about lice control has changed. We've got systemic lice control for any length of wool. And so where before we've always talked about sheep lice control as off shears and short wool, if you want to achieve eradication, or long wool, which will just hold it at bay. Now we sort of need to reset that thinking, probably more aligned to worm control, where we've got a strategic treatment. So that's your whole flock treatment, which might be annual, or if you're in a more pastoral area, you might be doing 2 treatments a year. And then we've got tactical treatments, which is where you've got a lice outbreak. So whether that's from the neighbours or, you're buying in sheep and you want to quarantine treat them. So rather than talk about short wool, long wool, we've now got a product where, in fact, the control is the same regardless of the length of wool. So we need to talk about, are we doing a strategic treatment, so an annual planned treatment or a biannual planned treatment, or are we doing a tactical treatment where we're just treating lice that's in a mob, or we're treating sheep that are coming in as a quarantine? And so basically it just expands where you can put your lice control. So you can do lice control now whenever you want, whenever you've got the labour for it, whenever it suits your operation. A lot of people say that around shearing, there's so much going on and so many things to do and they don't have enough labour. You can shift your lice control now. You could do it, later when you're putting on your pre-harvest fly control. You can add your lice control at that time. You could do it pre-lambing. You could do it at crutching. Whenever it really suits your operation and your labour units. When you have the labour there to do it, you can certainly do it any time. And it also allows you to adapt. So you can alter it because of the weather. It's not affected by rain, but if you do get rain at the time you want to do it and the yards are too muddy or there's a flood, you can just do it whenever you like. You're not restricted to that wool length, which puts that pressure on to I must treat now. You can adapt with your labour, you can adapt with your lambs, whether they're lambs at foot or you do it pre-lambing so you don't have them, and split shearing. So it really does help manage some of those challenges we have in our management to achieve lice control. So that pretty much concludes our discussion on, sheep lice, but also on the new oral lice product, Flexolt. So I guess we'll open to any questions.
Thanks so much, Jane. We've got several questions that have been submitted by the audience. The question that everyone's going to want to know, what's the cost of Flexolt compared to other products?
Yes, and it always comes up. Now, I can tell you, if you go and buy a 20-litre drum, you'll almost collapse at the price. But that's because there's more than 2,000 doses in that drum. So we've always got to think about whenever we're doing any treatment in sheep, whether it's a drench or a vaccine or a lice control, it's always a per head cost that we're looking at. Flexolt's actually, I believe, very reasonably priced. So it is slightly dearer than, and it will depend on the store, and there's lots of factors. We don't set the actual final price. So what we can say is it is slightly dearer than all of your basic backliners, but it's cheaper than a long wool product. So it sits nicely around there. It's not much dearer than your typical backliner, but you'll need to talk to your store, and they'll be able to give you the price on that.
No worries. And I guess with that, Jane, is we've got a lot of doses in a 20-litre drum. Expiry dates for the treatment, like how long's it gonna, if we go by 20 litres?
That's a really good question. It does come up a lot, actually. Probably should include it in the actual presentation, because there are a lot of doses in that drum. So if you don't have that many sheep, can I hold it over? From manufacturer, it has 3 years expiry. And that doesn't matter whether you've got it opened or not. So the expiry date on the drum will be 3 years from manufacture, and it'll be good until that point, regardless if it's opened or not, as long as you store it properly and you don't half fill it with water or leave the lid off or something, but it'll last for 3 years.
Yeah, excellent. And one more question on that type of area before we get into some other questions specific to secretions, etc. Is PPE? I see that the person comes, the person's wearing gloves, dosing. Is there a need for that sort of PPE? What's the PPE that producers are going to need to dose their sheep?
Yes. Okay. So PPE is very important, and you should always follow the label PPE requirements. Yes, the person in the photo is wearing gloves, and that is a requirement of the PPE. I guess the thing I'll say about that is that with the APVMA, so the regulatory body, and it's completely correct on their part, they have what we call default things around things like PPE. And so the default is that you need to wear elbow length chemical resistant gloves. And that's on any product that's registered. So if you actually go and look in your sheds and have a look at most of your drenches in the shed that you're using, on a regular basis, all the common drenches, I won't say their names, but if you go and have a look on your label, you'll find that most of them, actually almost all of them, there's a couple of exceptions, will say elbow length chemical resistant gloves. And that's because that's the default requirement. Unless we've done particular studies in humans to show otherwise, that's what all products will end up with. So yes, that is what's on the label, and that's what we recommend that you wear. And if you look on your drenches in the shed, you'll find that the same recommendation is on those.
Excellent. A question here from someone asking, could the product actually be added to water troughs to get or using some equipment to into a water trough through using some equipment to put it into the troughs to get the right dose into sheep? Is there scope, do you think, to change how we dose sheep?
Look, it's actually a really sensible thought. The problem we have with sheep and cattle and animals that are raised extensively, and even where we have it more intensively in sheep and cattle, they're still extensive if you compare them to poultry and pigs that are far more intensive. And we have no control over their consumption. So, and their consumption varies enormously depending on whether the day is hot or cold, whether it's cloudy or sunny, how much wool they have on them, what level, if are they pregnant, are they lactating. So unfortunately in animals, pasture-based animals, there is way too much variability in the amount of water that they consume. So we wouldn't be able to have a consistent dose. And when we're talking about chemicals to control lice and worms, underdosing causes all sorts of issues as far as resistance, and that's a big risk if you start mixing it with water. So it's not viable for pasture-based animals because of the variability of consumption, unfortunately.
Thank you. Okay, another one here. Jane, could you just recap how long the protection is with Flexolt?
Okay. Now, this is actually one of my little pet topics, but I'll try not to talk about it too much.
Perfect question then.
Perfect question. So protection periods. All the products on the market currently, except for your IGRs, of which there's very limited ones available now, and they're called insect growth regulators, and they do have a longer protection period. But all the other products which you commonly associate lice control are all what we call knockdown. So they're very short-lived and they don't really provide a protection period. They're all capable, they all hang around long enough to make sure all the lice are gone and all the eggs are gone, and basically there's no lice there 5 months later. They're not protecting the sheep for that period of time. They're only protecting the sheep right at the early stages, so that first sort of 2, 3, 4 weeks. And then you're at the mercy of management. And that's why, right at the start of the presentation, I really focused on management. That's the thing that will either get you to achieve successful control or not. We can't rely on chemicals to have a little armour around these sheep. And even if, as all these products do, they give you 3 to 4 weeks, that's 1 month. And there's another 11 months in the year that you need to keep those lice out. So no, it doesn't have a protection period. It'll carry you for that first sort of 3 weeks. Like virtually all the products on the market will do 3 to 4 weeks. But the rest of that protection period is entirely up to your management and keeping the lice out. One thing you could do with a product like Flexolt to try and give you not so much a protection period, but try and give you a longer protection or a longer barrier. When you shear sheep, you actually remove 2/3 of their lice, and then a heap more of them die because they're exposed to either hot or cold, depending on what time you shear. And so you've got hardly any lice. So you could use that shearing as a non-chemical treatment to really knock your lice around. It'll get rid of probably 90% of your lice. And then in a couple of months' time, 2 or 3 months' time, you could treat with Flexolt. And now if you've done that, you're 3 months off shears and you're treating with your lice control product, you've now only got 9 months to last with your management until you get the opportunity again to shear them. So there's ways you can do that to extend that period, but the bottom line is you're at the mercy of your management for at least 11 months. Products are knocked down, they get rid of the lice that are there at the time. They don't prevent them coming back.
Fantastic. Jane, I might make this the last question because we're getting close to 8:30. It's in response to shedding sheep and whether this product is effective on shedding sheep if they have lice.
Absolutely. So shedding sheep definitely carry lice. Obviously, it doesn't impact on their fleece value because their fleece has no value. So there's not often a lot of incentive to treat them. But they are sheep. So A, they have sheep lice, and B, Flexolt will work on them. So yeah, it'll certainly be effective in sheep lice on shedding sheep.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us for today's webinar. Jane, thank you so much for sharing your insight and expertise with us. It's much appreciated. If anyone has any additional questions, you can either contact me directly using the contact information in your webinar registration or flick me a text message and I'll pass those on to Jane to get some answers for you. We wish you a pleasant evening and we look forward to joining us for our next webinar.